Good morning, students. I am Dr. Balarubi, Assistant Professor at the Department of Economics. So, students, in today's class, we are going to discuss about the inflationary gap and stagflation. See, first, let us concentrate on fiscal and monetary policy. How this fiscal policy and monetary policy is manageable for this inflationary gap. Then we will concentrate on the meaning of stagflation and what are the causes of stagflation and what are the consequences we are facing due to this stagflation. These are the important aspects we are going to discuss in today's class. An inflationary gap is a macroeconomic concept that measures the difference between the current level of real GDP, that is the gross domestic product, and the GDP that would exist if an economy was operating at full employment. An inflationary gap exists when the demand for goods and services exceeds production due to factors such as higher levels of overall employment, increased trade activities, or elevated government expenditure. Against this backdrop, the real GDP can exceed the potential GDP, resulting in an inflationary gap. The inflationary gap is named as such because the relative rise in real GDP causes an economy to increase its consumption, leading prices to climb in the long run. So the inflationary gap normally it represents the point in the business cycle when the economy is expanding. Due to the higher number of funds available within the economy, consumers are more inclined to purchase goods and services. As demand for goods and services increases, but production has not yet compensated for the shift, prices rise to restore market equilibrium. When the potential GDP is higher than the real GDP, the gap is instead referred to as the deflationary gap. The other type of output gap is the recessionary gap, which describes an economy operating below its full employment equilibrium. So actually, macroeconomics is a study of the economy on the large scale because it deals with the things like national income, long-run aggregate supply curves, as well as aggregate demand curves. So one important macroeconomics principle is the Keynesian theory of inflationary gap. Now, let us concentrate on the fiscal and monetary policy to manage the inflationary gap. A government may choose to use the fiscal policy to help reduce an inflationary gap, often through decreasing the number of funds circulating within the economy. This can be accomplished through reductions in the government spending, tax increases, bond and security issues, as well as transfer payment reductions. So these adjustments to the fiscal conditions within the economy can serve to restore economic equilibrium. As the amount of money in circulation reduces, the overall demand for goods and services declines to reducing inflation. Central banks also have tools at their disposal to combat inflationary activity. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it makes borrowing funds more expensive. Tight monetary policy should substantially lower the amount of money available to most consumers, triggering less demand and prices or inflation to retreat. Once equilibrium is reached, the Fed or other central bank can then shift interest rates accordingly. Now, let us concentrate on the concept of stagflation. What is stagflation? stagflation in the sense by slow economic growth and relatively high unemployment or economic stagnation, which is the same time accompanied by the inflation, is considered as a stagflation. So, stagflation can be alternatively defined as a period of inflation combined with the decline in the gross domestic product. So, the term stagflation was first introduced during 1960s during a time of economic stress in the United Kingdom. The political leaders, he was speaking in the House of Commons. See, talking about inflation on one side and stagnation on the other side, he called it as a stagflation situation. Actually, it was later used again to describe the recessionary period in 1970s following the oil crisis when the US underwent a recession that saw few quarters of negative GDP growth. See, inflation doubled during 1973 and hit double digits in 1974. Unemployment hit 9% by May 1975. Stagflation led to the emergence of the misery index. So this index, which is the simple sum of the inflation rate and unemployment rate, served as a tool to show just how badly people were feeling when stagflation hit the economy. Now, let us concentrate on the causes as well as the consequences of stagflation. The causes of stagflation are heavily debated by economists as prevalent economic theory. Before the stagflation fueled the 1970s, didn't believe that it was possible since the Phillips curve supported the theory that unemployment and inflation were inversely linked. However, economists have suggested several theories for what causes stagflation. The first consequence is the supply shock. This supply shock theory, it proves that stagflation occurs as a result of a sudden decrease in the supply of a service or commodity. This causes prices to increase dramatically, which usually reduces profit margins for most companies and slows economic growth. So the next one is bad monetary policy. It is bad monetary policy. Actually, it believes that stagflation is often result of bad economic policy. The central bank and the government's attempt to regulate the economy often leads to them making the wrong choices. For example, prior to the 1970s, the US was focused on maximum employment across their economy after the Employment Act of 1946, which inadvertently caused inflation to increase as well as impacted employment and growth. Government policies regulating the economy can also have an impact as shown by the Nixon strategy of devaluing the dollar and instituting wage and price freezes. It is normally known as the Nixon shock. So ultimately, the central banks and legislations struggle with how to tackle stagflation, since inventions to support their objectives of price stability, low unemployment, and economic growth can conflict. The next one is differential accumulation, a theory created by economists. These two economists, the differential accumulation explanation of stagflation argues that there is a relationship between mergers and acquisitions, stagflation and globalization. Similar to the supply shock theory, they possess that the differential accumulation drives mergers and acquisitions, which concentrate the power to limit the supply of commodities and accumulated capital in fewer hands and leads to higher risk of stagflation. Then the next one is demand pull. It proposed by economist Loyo. The demand pull stagflation theory suggests that stagflation can occur exclusively from monetary shocks without the need for a supply-related shock. So this occurs when government institute monetary tightening regulations such as raising the federal interest rate or a reduction in the money supply. And the next one is the cost push. It is cost push in the sense this cost push inflation theory sees supply side inflation as a key driver of inflation. In this case, rising prices lead to unemployment since they usually reduce profit margins for companies, which leads to reduced economic output. So supply side inflation can also be impacted by things like tariff increases in wages or labor shortages. And the next one is the end of the gold standard. So historically, Nixon's ending of the convertibility of US dollars to gold is theorized as one driver of 1970s taxation. The gold standard made the US vulnerable to runs on gold as there were more dollars in foreign hands than gold reserves in the US. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window that allowed for the exchange of dollars for gold. In 1976, the value of the US dollar was officially decoupled from gold. Both moves devalued the dollar, which impacted inflation and economic growth and lead to stagflation. Let us concentrate on the consequences of economic stagflation. What are the consequences of stagflation on regular people? So when stagflation occurs, it has a direct impact on affordability, making it harder for many to meet basic needs, especially those who are among the unemployed. For those who are unemployed, stagflation could lead to risk of job losses and lower wages, so which would decrease consumer confidence and purchasing power. Investors also suffer from stagflation. Stagflation generally results in lower profit margins due to higher input prices and lower sales. That has an impact on the stock market as the S&P 500 in the last 60 years has returned an average of 2.5% per quarter. But historically returns 2.1%, minus 2.1% during the times of stagflation. According to Goldman Sachs report, stagflation can directly impact investors by decreasing the growth in companies' earnings per share, which impacts stock prices. Dividend investors may also negatively affected as companies reduce or suspend their dividends to conserve cash. For those who invest in growth stocks, there would be significant losses as many have expected growth targets priced into their equities that stagflation would make it harder to meet. If stagflation occurs long enough, some companies might go bankrupt, causing significant investors' losses. The inability of companies to repay their debts would likely also affect bond prices. However, there are ways that investors can hedge the risk of inflation, including funds that are designed specifically to navigate high inflation periods. So investors worried about the impact of stagflation on the portfolios that might want to shift their investment strategy or decide to remain the blue chip stock in staple industries with steady earnings that are likely to weather stagflation or recover quickly. Stagflation that could impact international trade by increasing global commodity prices for everything, including food, making it more expensive to do business and increasing inflation further. National or global unemployment also reduce the global economic output, consumer confidence and spending, increasing unemployment in more areas because of the interconnectedness of global trade. Different national policies for tackling stagflation might also impact global trade as these policies create different conditions for recovery that might conflict. So this often affects emerging and developing economies more, since many of these countries do not have the capacity to institute the kinds of monetary or stimulates policies other nations use to tackle taxation due to a high deficit to GDP ratio. An inflationary gap is a type of economic gap where a company's real GDP is higher than its potential GDP. In other words, when the real aggregate demand is higher than the projected aggregate demand, if the economy were operating at full employment. So it means that the citizens of the country are demanding more goods and services than the business can provide. When an inflationary gap occurs, the economy is out of equilibrium level and the price level of goods and services will rise to make up for the increased demand and insufficient supply. And that rise in prices is called demand pull inflation. So most economies experience inflationary gaps naturally as a result of boom bust cycle. The United States experienced the inflationary gap during 2006. When the economy was booming, unemployment was low, wage rates increased, and more households had a disposable income and higher purchasing power. This caused an increase in demand, but due to the wage increases, businesses had less money for production, causing a discrepancy between the high level of demand and the low level of output, a textbook inflationary gap. Now let us discuss about what is the meaning of inflationary gap. See, it means it occurs when the aggregate demand is higher than the projected demand, which can be caused by two different things. One is the rise in the aggregate demand and another one is the fall in the aggregate supply. How this type of inflationary gap is managed? See, there are two ways. One is with the help of fiscal policy we can manage, and another one is with the help of monetary policy also we can manage. So these are the different important aspects we have discussed in today's class. Thank you, friends.